I'm Nancy Thompson, your storyteller of American folklore, thrilling mysteries, and more. Join me for today's tale. Out west of North Rivertown lies a little place called Old Well Village. It's tucked right up against the dry, rugged hills to the south, with the wide North River flowing nearby and the neighboring town of Fulton just across the way. Folks around here started calling it Old Well Village for a reason. There's an ancient well right in the heart of the place. Word has it, something curious happened here years back, a story that's still fresh in the minds of the old-timers. Old Well Village sits snug against the base of a big OL mountain, surrounded by thick green woods. The people living here didn't have much to do with the outside world, but they got by just fine. Self-sufficient, well-fed, and content, that's how they lived. Sure, they weren't rich, but they were happy enough. Over time, though, the village started aging. The young folks would head out past the mountain, chasing bigger dreams, and hardly any of them ever came back.
Now, the village elder, Frank Johnson, is pushing 60 something.
Born and raised right here, he's never once stepped foot beyond the hills. He married, had kids, and spent his whole life in this little pocket of the world. Frank's got a son named Freddie Johnson who, after starting a family of his own, took off with a few other villagers to see what's out there. That was years ago, and he hasn't been back since. Today, Frank's sitting down with his 9-year-old grandson, Nathan Johnson, calling him over. "Hey kid," he says, "when you grow up, you planning on leaving the village too?" Nathan's not sure why his grandpa's asking him this out of nowhere. But kids don't lie easy, so he answers straight up, "Mom says Dad went far away and never came back. She told me when I'm older, I gotta go find him." Frank listens to his grandson and lets out a long sigh. "Out there," he says, "it's all bright lights and big promises.
Leaving the easy part. Coming home's what's took."
Nathan doesn't buy it though. He pipes up, "But I've got you, Mom, and Grandma here. Why would I ditch you all?" Frank looks at the boy's innocent face and keeps going. "Maybe your dad's got a wife and folks out there now. If he came back, wouldn't he be leaving them behind instead?"
Nathan goes quiet.
He doesn't get who these folks out there are supposed to be. He thinks on it hard, and as he heads out of the room, he turns back and says, "I promise, Grandpa."
Even if he leave, he'll come home.
Frank hears that and gives a bitter little chuckle. Back in the day, Freddie had slapped his chest and made the same promise. But once he got hitched and had kids out there, no promise could tie him down. How's an old man supposed to trust a kid's word now? This village is a pretty spot, birds singing, wildflowers blooming, but it's got one big flaw. Hemmed in by those towering mountains, water's always been scarce. The whole place depends on a trickle of a stream out back, barely squeezing through the rocks. Every day, folks line up to fill their buckets, one per household, and that's the limit. Over the years, that slow drip of water collected in a low spot, forming a little pond a few acres wide. It's not deep, but it's enough for washing clothes and getting by.
Still, it's a hard life when every drop counts.
A few more years rolled by in Old Well Village. Nathan Johnson grew up tall and strong, but by then, his grandpa Frank's health had taken a turn. The old man's body just couldn't keep up anymore. Right before he passed, Frank called Nathan to his bedside, took his grandson's hand and said, "Son, I know you're gonna head out past those hills someday. But can you promise your old grandpa one thing?" Nathan and his mom, Lisa Johnson, had been looked after by Frank all these years. The kid's heart was full of gratitude, so without even blinking, he said, "Grandpa, don't talk like that's all you've got."
One promise?
"I'd give you 10 if you asked." Frank shook his head, stubborn as ever. "No boy," he said, firm but fading, "just this one thing, and I can go with no regrets." Nathan could tell whatever Grandpa was about to say mattered a whole lot. Was it about his dad, Freddie? But what came next caught him off guard. Frank's voice dropped low. "Water's life, Nathan. Out here, it's too darn hard to come by. I've spent years poking around, figuring things out, and I'm sure of it, right in the middle of that pond in the village, there's a deep spot. It's gotta connect to an underground stream. If we can break through that hole and dig a well, it'd fix the water problem for good." Nathan's eyes went wide. It was the first he'd heard of this. "If it's in the pond," he said, "why don't I just round up the folks and we'll dig it up right now?" Frank grabbed his arm quick, shaking his head again.
No, not yet.
"You can't do it till the dry season hits. And before you start, make sure the village has some water stored up. Nathan finally got it. Grandpa was worried they'd dig and come up empty. If they drained the pond now and struck out, it'd spell disaster for everyone. Grandpa, I promise, Nathan said, gripping the old man's hand. I'll find a way to make it work for the village. After Frank passed, Nathan said goodbye to his mom, Lisa. I'm heading out past the hills, he told her. I'll find Dad and bring him home, I swear it. Lisa looked at her boy, all grown and ready to go, her eyes full of worry. She was scared he'd end up like her husband, gone for good. But she let him go, clinging to a thin hope he'd keep his word. So Nathan left Old Well Village, hitting the road with nothing but grit. He asked around, faced all kinds of trouble, and finally tracked down a lead in Lakewood County. Word was, there was a family there, the Hendersons, with a son-in-law from out of town named Freddie Johnson. Folks said he matched the description of Nathan's dad, gone from home for years. Nathan thanked the guy who tipped him off and hightailed it toward the Henderson place. Whatever happened next, he was set on getting answers. After all those years of Freddie abandoning them, didn't he owe his son that much? Was his conscience really clear leaving his old family behind? When Nathan got to the Henderson estate, he didn't even make it through the gate before the groundskeeper, Tom Henderson, stopped him cold.
Who are you looking for, Kit?
Tom asked, squinting at him. I'm Nathan Johnson, he said. I'm here for a man named Freddie Johnson. Before he could finish, Tom yanked him aside, eyes wide.
You're Nathan Johnson.
Nathan blinked, thrown off. Yeah, that's me. How do you know my name? He'd never set foot outside the hills before this trip. How could anyone here know him? Was the Henderson son-in-law really his dad, Freddie Johnson? Tom sized him up, then fished $2 out of his pocket. Look, find yourself a place to crash nearby, he said, handing over the cash.
I'll talk to the boss. Don't go far.
Nathan didn't get it, but he took the money and nodded. If he'd found his dad's trail, what was a day or two more? After shooing Nathan off, Tom bolted the gate and hustled to the study, hollering, Sir, we've got trouble. Freddie Johnson was hunched over some ledgers when Tom burst in, all flustered.
Calm down, Tom, Freddie snapped. What's got you in a twist?
Speak up. Tom caught his breath and spilled it. The boss said if a young guy named Nathan Johnson ever showed up here, I had to tell you right away. He's here, sir, right now. Freddie hushed him with a sharp gesture, peeked out the window, then locked the door tight. Tell me everything, he said, low and slow.
What is I?
What did he look like? Tom laid it all out, how Nathan had rolled up asking for him, every detail of the kid's face and voice. Freddie's brows furrowed deep as he listened. He pulled a wad of cash from a drawer and pressed it into Tom's hand. Keep your mouth shut about this, he said. Play it smart, and there's more where that came from. Got it. Thanks, sir, Tom said with a greedy grin, pocketing the bills and slipping out. Meanwhile, Nathan found a cheap motel nearby. That night, a knock rattled his door. Who's there? He called out. It's me, Nate, came the reply from outside. Freddie Johnson's voice hit him like a freight train. Nathan Johnson's heart raced as he recognized that voice, his dad's, echoing through years of dreams. Even after all this time, it was unmistakable. Dad. Nathan flung the motel door open, tears welling up as he saw the man standing there. Freddie Johnson looked older, weathered, but it was him. Come in, Freddie said, nudging Nathan back inside with a careful glance over his shoulder. He stepped in after, shutting the door and double-checking the parking lot through the curtains. What are you doing here, Nate? How's Grandpa? Your mom okay? Grandpa's gone, Nathan said, his voice cracking. Mom's been sick. She needs you home, Dad. Freddie let out a heavy sigh, walked over to the rickety table, and poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the motel's cheap pot. I can't go back, Freddie said, staring into the mug. I've got a family here now. If I leave, I just disappoint even more people. Dad, that's cold, Nathan shot back, anger flaring. You walked out 16 years ago. Ever think about how we made it without you? Freddie's shoulders slumped. I owe you, I know that. Take this and go, he said, pulling a check from his jacket and sliding it across the table. Don't come back. Nathan shook his head hard. I don't want your money. I promised Mom I'd bring you home. If you won't come, I'll tell the Hendersons you've been lying to them all this time. Freddie's face darkened, his brow creasing. Fine, he said after a tense pause. Stay here a few days. Let me tie up some loose ends, and I'll go with you. All right, I'll wait, Nathan said, a flicker of hope lighting up his eyes. Freddie left the motel room, and Tom Henderson sidled up from the shadows outside. How'd it go, boss? Tom asked, smirking. They say a tiger won't eat its own cub, Freddie muttered, his voice ice cold. But he's forcing my hand. Make it clean, Tom. Yes, sir, Tom replied with a chilling grin. He'd been Freddie's right-hand man long enough to know the drill. Dirty work was second nature by now. Late that night, Nathan was dead asleep when soft footsteps jolted him awake. He rolled out of bed and crept to the door, heart pounding. The lock jiggled, then snapped open. Two figures in dark hoodies burst in, knives flashing as they slashed at the empty bed. Boss, he's gone quiet, one of them grunted after a few wild swings, noticing the lump was just pillows. Nathan, hidden behind the door, seized the moment and bolted out into the night. Don't let him get away, the other yelled, spotting the movement. They gave chase, blades glinting under the streetlights. Nathan sprinted into an alley, lungs burning, and saw a dead end ahead. Just as panic set in, a side door creaked open. A young woman grabbed his arm and hissed, "Quick, hide in here." He stumbled inside, the door slamming shut behind him. Catching his breath, Nathan studied her. Sharp eyes, dark hair, maybe 20-something. "Who are you?" he panted. "Why'd you help me?" "I'm Tara Henderson," she said, peering at him cautiously. "And those guys trying to kill you? They're not from my family, they're your dad's goons." "You're talking nonsense," Nathan snapped, shaking his head. "He said he'd come home with me. Why would he hurt me?" "What kind of man is Freddie Johnson?" Tara asked, her voice cutting. "Don't you know by now?" Her words hit Nathan like a punch, shaking loose the doubts he'd buried. Turns out, Tara was a Henderson through and through. The story went back over a decade. The Hendersons had one daughter, Grace Henderson, and her granddad wanted her to marry well. She ended up with a scholar named Victor Miles, and they had Tara. One day, while Grace was out on a charity run, bandits jumped her. Freddie swooped in, playing the hero, and they fell hard for each other fast. Word of their affair got back to Old Man Henderson and Victor quick. But not long after, both the old man and Victor dropped dead from some mysterious illness. With them out of the way, Freddie slid right into the Henderson family, no questions asked. Tara, growing up, pieced it together and swore she'd make him pay for her granddad and dad. She'd been collecting dirt on Freddie for years. That night, she'd spotted Tom sneaking around and tailed him, stumbling onto the ugly truth. Freddie wasn't just a runaway husband. He'd staged that whole hero act to worm his way into the Hendersons. Nathan listened, disbelief turning to horror. His dad hadn't just ditched them. He'd built a whole life on lies and blood. "You want to turn him in with me?" Tara asked, locking eyes with him. Nathan hesitated. Freddie was still his father, flesh and blood. But if his crimes stayed buried, more innocent folks would get hurt. "He sent those guys after me this time," Tara pressed. "Next time, it could be your mom, or the whole village." Nathan's blood ran cold imagining that. "No," he said, clenching his fists. "I won't let him hurt Mom or anyone else. I'm in, let's turn him in." "All right," Tara said, a grim smile tugging at her lips. "Tomorrow, we go to the sheriff together. He's not hurting anyone else." The next morning, Lakewood County's courthouse was buzzing as the sheriff opened the trial. With Nathan Johnson and Tara Henderson laying it all out, Freddie Johnson and his wife, Grace Henderson, were hauled in cuffs. Before they dragged Freddie off to face his sentence, he caught Nathan's eye one last time. "Kid," he said, voice thick with regret, "I messed up bad in this life. Should have listened to your grandpa and never left those hills." Nathan stared at his dad's hunched figure and shouted after him, "If you got one more shot, would you come home with me?" Freddie just shook his head, silent, but Nathan already knew the answer. Like Grandpa Frank always said, leaving's easy, coming home's the hard part. The world out there's full of traps you don't see coming. Before Nathan headed out, Tara grabbed his arm. "Hey, thanks for this," she said. "Why don't you stick around?" "Nah," Nathan replied, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "I've got folks waiting back home." "But you're leaving," Tara said, tears brimming. "There's people here waiting for you too." "Sorry, Tara," Nathan said softly. "I made a promise to Grandpa." With that, he turned and started walking. "Wait up, Nate," Tara called, jogging after him with a packed bag of her own. Nathan spun around, eyes wide. "What's this about?" "Town's gotten dull," she said, grinning. "Thought I'd see what's up in those hills." "What, you don't want me along?" "Nah, I mean, it's rough up there," Nathan stammered. "You sure you can handle it?" "Rough people are the real trouble," Tara shot back, grabbing his hand. "Place doesn't matter." After Tara sold off the Henderson estate, she and Nathan decided to head back to the mountains together. They figured they'd split some of the cash with the village folks, let them choose, head out to the world or stay put. It took months of hiking trails and crossing creeks, but they finally rolled back into Old Well Village. Lisa Johnson spotted her son coming up the path with a pretty girl in tow and couldn't stop smiling. Over dinner that night, she leaned in and asked, "Did you find your dad, Nate?" "Mom," Nathan started, but Tara cut in smooth as butter. "Ma'am, he's gone. Died saving somebody." Lisa's eyes welled up, tears spilling over. Hard to say if it was grief or relief after 16 years of waiting for an answer she could live with. When she stepped into the kitchen, Nathan turned to Tara, puzzled. "Why'd you lie to her?" "He's gone, Nate," Tara said gently. "Whatever he did, your mom didn't deserve it. No point making the living suffer for someone else's mistakes." The next day, Nathan and Tara handed out the cash to the villagers and laid it out straight. "Grandpa's last wish was a well right here in the village," Nathan said. "That way, we'd never run dry. But we can't wait for a drought to start digging. We've got to prep now, find a way out before trouble hits. You've got money in your hands. If you want to leave, go live good out there. If you stay, we'll tough it out together and build something real." The village erupted in chatter. Then an old-timer, 80 if he was a day, hobbled forward with his cane. He thumped it on the ground and pointed at Nathan. "I believe you, boy," he rasped. "You're the first one who left them hills and came back. These old bones been here my whole life, ain't going nowhere. I'll die right here in this dirt if it comes to it." His words lit a spark. One by one, folks piped up. Nobody wanted to leave. So they got to work. First, they dug a little backup pond somewhere else in the village and shifted the stored water over. Once the main pond dried up, Nathan stood at its center, heart pounding. "This is it," he said, voice shaking with hope. "Let's dig that well together." The villagers didn't hesitate. Shovels hit dirt, and they went at it, praying they'd strike water down below. The folks of Old Well Village dug for 2 solid weeks, sweat soaking through their shirts. The well shaft sank over 30 feet into the earth, but the bottom stayed bone dry. Doubt started creeping in. Some villagers threw down their shovels, grumbling it was a fool's errand. A few even slipped out under cover of night, heading for the hills with their share of the cash. "Tara, what if me and Grandpa got it all wrong?" Nathan muttered, staring into the dusty pit. His confidence was crumbling fast. "Your grandpa wasn't wrong," Tara said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "And you're even righter. Digging this well's for the folks who come after us. If a drought hits and that stream dries up, it'll be too late then. Finding water now's the village's lifeline. We can't quit hoping." "But we've been at it half a month, and there's nothing," Nathan sighed, his voice thin. "What if there's no water down there?" "Look at that." Tara cut in, pointing ahead with a shout. A turtle was crawling across the dirt, slow and steady. A turtle. Grandpa used to say wherever there's a turtle, there's water. Nathan's face lit up. He scooped the little critter into his hands and peered down the well again. Sure enough, clear water was bubbling up from the bottom, sparkling in the dim light. "Tara, you were right," he yelled, pulling her into a hug. "We can't give up hope." Word spread like wildfire, water in the well. The gloom lifted from the village, replaced by whoops and hollers. "Thank the good Lord," folks cheered, clapping each other on the back. The old-timer from before stepped up again, leaning on his cane. "We owe this to Nathan and Tara," he said, voice gravelly but firm. "If they hadn't stuck it out, where'd we be? Let's set that turtle free, let it watch over us from now on." Nathan held the turtle up high. "Sounds good to me," he said, grinning. The villagers nodded as one, and they lowered the little guy down to the well's bottom. From that day on, water worries were a thing of the past. That well became the village's pride, a sacred spot they'd never take for granted. To thank Nathan and Tara for pulling them through, the folks threw them a big wedding bash. It was all laughter and music, a real shindig. Nathan got so caught up in the toasts, hoisting cups of cider with everyone, that he passed out cold before he even made it to the honeymoon suite. In his dreams, he saw the village well, clear as day. That turtle climbed up to the rim and fixed him with a steady look. "You're a good kid who keeps his word," it said, and Nathan's ears caught a familiar twang, Grandpa Frank's voice. "Grandpa, is that you?" Nathan called out, his heart racing. "Good boy," the turtle went on. "Tonight's your big night, don't light the lamps." Then it vanished into thin air. "Grandpa, where'd you go?" Nathan shouted, jerking awake. Just a dream, he realized, rubbing his eyes. That old turtle must have been passing on a message. He stumbled into the dark bedroom and called out, "Honey. No lights tonight, okay?" Tara's voice came back, soft and warm from the shadows. Nathan grinned, remembering the dream. "Sure thing," he chuckled. "A spring night's worth its weight in gold. Let's keep the dark." Next morning, Nathan woke up tangled in the sheets, but Tara was nowhere in sight. He bolted upright, threw on his clothes, and tore through the village looking for her. No luck, not a trace. Lisa caught him running around like a headless chicken and grabbed his arm. "Nate, what's wrong? Where's Tara?" "She's gone, Mom," he panted. "I don't know where she went." "Tara? Who's that?" Lisa asked, her face scrunching up in confusion. Nathan tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He raced to the well, where the villagers were hauling up buckets, all smiles and chatter. Seeing their happy faces, it hit him. Grandpa's words rang true again. The glitter fades, the song ends, and it's all just a dream. That old well, though? That was the village's real hope, standing solid through it all. Folks back then planted seeds so the next generation could sit in the shade. Drinking from this well, Nathan knew they'd never forget who dug it. In the story, the village hugged those mountains tight, always short on water. Plenty of folks couldn't hack it, left for the bright lights and never looked back, not even for kin. Nathan, our hero, might have dreamed it all, or maybe he really walked out there and back. Either way, he kept Grandpa's word. He didn't chase the world's dazzle. He came home, rallied the village, and dug that well, fixing their biggest problem. Seeing those smiles, he finally got what real happiness was. In real life, I see it too, rural towns full of old folks, left behind. Kids move off, hardly visit, maybe once a year if that. I wonder, those long nights, an old-timer alone in bed, missing their kids, what do they do? Can't call them up, can't wander out, sick with no one to help. Where's the family they raised then? Hope this tale sticks with you. Homes looking better these days, cities ain't all that, just crowded. Swing by and see your folks when you can. Alright, that's the first story done. Stick around, Nancy Thompson's got another one coming. You won't want to miss it. Caught by this one? You'll love the next. It's called The Greedy Widow, stabbed by her daughter-in-law, framed by the river, a judge questions the butler. Starts with an old scholar down by the Mississippi, name of Luke Decker. Here's the second tale for you folks. Nancy Thompson back with another slice of American folklore. This one's called The Greedy Widow, stabbed by her daughter-in-law, framed by the river, a judge questions the butler. Let's dive in. Down along the Mississippi River, there lived an old scholar named Luke Decker. Luke was a bookworm through and through, spent his whole life buried in pages. Trouble was, he wasn't exactly a genius. He'd taken the state exams more times than you could count, but the best he ever got was a teaching certificate. No big-shot career for him. Since Luke poured all his energy into chasing that elusive degree, his home was about as bare as a barn in winter. For walls and not much else. Early on, he'd married a local gal, and they had a daughter they named Grace Decker. But when Grace was just 5, her mom passed away from a bad fever. From then on, it was just Luke and his little girl, scraping by together. Grace was sharp as a tack and wise beyond her years. She learned to wash clothes and cook supper before most kids could tie their shoes. kept the house spick and span too. On top of that, she took after her mama, real pretty, even as a tyke. By the time Grace hit 16, she was turning heads all over town, graceful as her name, with a smile that could melt ice. Every fella who crossed her path wanted her hand, dreaming of making her their wife. But Luke had other plans. He'd spent his life chasing a dream that never panned out, and it gnawed at him. If Grace could marry a bright young man with a future, he figured, maybe she'd land herself a cushy life, maybe even a governor's wife someday. So he sifted through the suitors like a prospector panning for gold. After some hard thinking, Luke settled on Victor Shaw, a scholar from town. Victor's dad had died young, leaving his mom to raise him solo, a tough row to hoe, but she'd pulled it off. Victor was a brainy kid, already holding a teaching certificate like Luke, though his family was just as dirt poor. Still, Luke saw potential. Poverty's just for now, he told himself. If Victor makes it big someday, Grace will reap the rewards. So half a year later, Grace Decker tied the knot with Victor Shaw. After the wedding, Grace was a model daughter-in-law, respectful to Victor's mom, doting on her husband. Folks around town called her a rare catch, the kind of wife you don't find every day. But Victor's mom, Martha Shaw, didn't see it that way. To her, a wife doing her duty, cooking, cleaning, keeping the peace, was nothing special. Victor's out there studying his tail off every day, she'd say. Grace ought to handle everything at home so he can focus. That's her job. No matter how hard Grace worked, Martha barely gave her a nod. But let Grace slip up even a little, burn the biscuits or miss a spot on the floor, and Martha'd blow it sky high, griping that Grace was a no-good spendthrift who'd ruin them all. Grace took it in stride, swallowing her pride every time. Most gals could vent to their own folks when the in-laws got rough, but not Grace. Her dad, Luke, wouldn't hear it. He'd say, Victor's read all them high-minded books, his character's gotta be solid. If his mom's hard on you, Grace, you're probably not pulling your weight over there. 6 months into the marriage, Victor and Grace got the news they were expecting, a little Shaw on the way. Martha and Victor were over the moon. From the day Grace started showing, Martha quit her nagging cold. Grace thought to herself, this is it, happy days at last. But that peace didn't last 2 months. Victor kissed Grace goodbye and headed off to the state capitol for the big exam, aiming to climb higher than that teaching gig. Martha and Grace stayed behind, counting the days, hoping he'd come back with a title, maybe even top of the list. Thing is, life's got a way of throwing curveballs. And folks? They've got their share of storms too. Victor Shaw was on the road to the state capitol, chasing that big exam, when fate took a nasty turn. Out in the wild stretch between towns, a gang of outlaws ambushed him. At first, they just wanted his satchel, travel money, a few books, nothing fancy. But Victor clung to it like his life depended on it, refusing to let go. That riled the robbers up something fierce. One of them pulled a knife and slashed at him, leaving Victor bleeding out on the dirt. The gang grabbed the bag and hightailed it, disappearing into the brush. Out there, miles from help, Victor didn't stand a chance. Too much blood, no one around. He was gone before the sun dipped low. When the news trickled back to the Mississippi River town, it hit Grace Decker and Martha Shaw like a thunderclap. Martha fainted dead away, and Grace, heartbroken as she was, had to hold it together. Pregnant and grieving, she saw to Victor's burial, laying him to rest proper. After Victor was gone, Martha spent her days crying into her handkerchief. Grace, with a baby on the way, had to fend for herself, cooking, cleaning, keeping the house from falling apart. It was a rough go, no two ways about it. Time marched on, and Grace gave birth to a chubby little boy, naming him Thomas Shaw after Victor's middle name. Seeing her grandson perked Martha up some, easing the gloom that had settled over her. But with no breadwinner, the family was strapped. Grace and Martha couldn't heft a plow or swing an axe, so they turned to needlework, sewing quilts and embroidering linens to scrape by. Old habits die hard though. Martha started picking at Grace again. One day it was, that boy's coat's too thin, Thomas'll catch his death. The next it was, you're scrubbing them clothes too hard, Grace, wasting good fabric. Never mind how Grace busted her back. To Martha, it was never enough. She'd slid right back into her sharp-tongued ways, just like before Grace was expecting. Grace took it all, thinking of Victor who'd never once stood up for her. She was barely past 19, and here she was, stuck. Is this it? She wondered. A widow for life, under Martha's thumb forever. The thought chewed at her, and soon enough, she started dreaming of a fresh start, maybe remarrying, finding a new path. She spilled her heart to her dad, Luke Decker. Luke sighed long and low, then said, "Grace, it's my fault. I pinned all my busted hopes on Victor, thinking he'd make something of himself for you. If I'd picked a regular fella instead, you might be happy now. If you want to remarry, I won't stop you. Tomorrow, I'll head to the matchmaker in town, see if she's got any decent prospects lined up." Luke got to work, asking around for a good man to give Grace a second chance. With her gentle ways and striking looks, word spread fast. Plenty of eligible bachelors came knocking, eager to court her. But when Martha caught wind of it, she flew into a rage. "You're a Shaw now, Grace," she hollered. "Wed into this family, bore us a son, you're ours, living or dead. Remarry? Over my dead body. You try it, and I'll show you. I'll take myself out and drag little Thomas with me. What's the point of him growing up if you're off starting over? He'd starve anyway. Better we both go quick." Grace's heart sank. She wanted out bad, but Martha's threat stopped her cold. Thomas was her world, her one soft spot. The idea of Martha dragging him into some desperate act scared her straight. So she buried the remarriage idea deep, vowing to stick it out for her boy. From then on, Grace poured everything into raising Thomas Shaw. And here's the kicker. Thomas inherited his dad's knack for books. He hit the studies hard, soaking up lessons like a sponge. His teacher even bragged, "That boy's sharper than Victor ever was. Keep at it, and he'll land a big title someday, mark my words." Luke's words lit a fire in Grace. After giving up her own dreams, Thomas was her whole life now. Watching him grow smarter every day warmed her heart like nothing else. Years rolled by, and Thomas hit 15. By then, Martha had passed on, leaving Grace free of her shadow. The year before, Grace had found a wife for Thomas, a sweet girl named Clara Tate. Now Grace was the mother-in-law, and she swore she wouldn't treat Clara the way Martha had treated her. She went out of her way to be kind, and Clara, grateful as could be, returned the favor. The two got along like peas in a pod. The next year, Thomas took the county exams and passed with flying colors, earning his teaching certificate. Grace and Clara threw a feast to celebrate: roast chicken, cornbread, the works. The local judge, Walter Kane, heard about Thomas's grit, losing his dad young, raised by a mom who never remarried, and admired Grace for it. He even sent her a plaque with big, bold letters: "Faithful wife, steadfast mother." Grace smiled when it arrived, but if you looked close, there was a flicker of sorrow in her eyes. Time kept rolling, and a few more years slipped by along the Mississippi. Thomas Shaw, Grace Decker's boy, headed up to the state capitol for the big exams and came out shining, passed with honors and landed a government job. He was a clerk in the capitol now, a real step up. Grace and Clara Tate, his wife, packed their bags and moved to the city with him. After all those hard years, Grace went from a small-town gal to a lady of the house in a fine government residence. One day, Thomas sat Grace down. "Mom," he said, "I've got to head out tomorrow. The governor's sending me down south to handle a flood relief job. Might take 2 or 3 months before I'm back. You take care of yourself here, all right?" Grace chuckled, waving him off. "If it's the governor's orders, you go on and do your duty. Don't worry about home, we've got plenty of help here. Everything will be fine." Thomas hugged her goodbye and set off for the south. When he got there, the mess was worse than he'd figured. Floodwaters had swallowed whole towns. Folks were desperate, hungry, and scrambling for aid. Thomas handed out food rations as fast as he could, but there were too many hands reaching. Some grabbed their share and came back for more, turning the relief line into a shouting match. It wore Thomas down quick. He stood there, watching the chaos, feeling like he was drowning too. Just when he was at his wit's end, a fella named Henry Foster stepped up. "I've got a fix for this mess," Henry said, all confidence. Thomas sized him up, 30-something, tall as a barn door, and easy on the eyes. "All right, let's hear it," Thomas said, motioning him into the relief tent to talk it over. Henry laid it out plain. "This flood's dragged on too long. People are scared stiff. They're hoarding because they don't know if help's coming again. Here's the trick. Mix some sand into the grain bags. The real hungry ones'll take it and make do. The rest, the ones with full bellies, won't bother with gritty mush." Thomas gave it a shot, and darn if it didn't work. The lines thinned out, the greedy backed off, and the neediest got fed. From then on, Thomas and Henry teamed up to tame the flood relief, and they hit it off like old pals. 3 months later, Thomas was packing to head back to the capital. The night before he left, he clapped Henry on the shoulder. "Been side by side with you all this time, and all I know's your name, Henry Foster. I'm leaving tomorrow, so this is goodbye for now. Hope we cross paths again." Henry's face fell, looking lonesome. "This flood took my whole family," he said. "Now you're going too. Ain't got no kin or friends left after this." Thomas felt a pang hearing that. "Shoot, Henry," he said, "if you've got no one, come with me. My house could use a good butler. Stick around, and I promise I won't steer you wrong." Henry perked up, standing tall. "If you're offering, I'm in," he said with a nod. Next day, Thomas brought Henry Foster back to the capital. He introduced him to Grace and Clara, who took a shine to him right off. Henry was a big guy, polite as pie, and carried himself with a natural charm. They set him up as the household butler, and he settled in smooth. One afternoon after lunch, Clara grabbed some apples and a slice of pie to take to Grace's room. She knocked, but it took a while for Grace to crack the door. When Clara stepped in, she noticed Grace looked pale as a ghost, worn out, almost sickly. "Mom," Clara said, worried, "I saw you at lunch today. You barely ate a bite before you got queasy. You catching a cold? Should I call the doc?" Grace's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "No, no, doctor," she snapped, shaking her head fast. "I'm fine, Clara, nothing's wrong." Clara blinked, thrown off. She'd never seen Grace act so jumpy. Curiosity gnawed at her as she studied her mother-in-law closer. For a second, she thought of morning sickness, same signs she'd had when she was expecting. But then she shook it off. Grace has been a widow for years, she told herself. No way that's it. Grace, all flustered, hustled Clara out the door before she could say more. Clara wanted to push, but Grace's nerves were too raw, so she let it drop and left. That night at supper, Clara had the cook whip up Grace's favorite, chicken pot pie, but Grace never showed. Clara waited, watching the table, but nothing. "Something's off today," she muttered. She sent a maid to check on Grace, just to be sure. Not long after, a scream ripped through the house from Grace's room. Clara bolted up and ran to see. When she burst in, there was Grace, hanging from the rafters, a rope tight around her neck. Clara couldn't believe it. "She was fine yesterday," she gasped, yelling for help. The servants rushed in, cut her down, but it was too late. Grace wasn't breathing. Clara broke down, sobbing loud enough to shake the walls. Right then, Thomas dashed in from outside, saw his mom lifeless, and crumpled. Grief hit him hard, but something else nagged at him too. Mom was always steady, he thought. Why'd she do this out of nowhere? He started asking around the house. The servants pieced it together. She couldn't eat much at lunch, went back to her room. Mrs. Clara took her some snacks after, and they had a little spat. By afternoon, she'd strung herself up. Thomas turned to Clara, eyes wide with shock, and grabbed her arm. "What happened?" he demanded, voice shaking. Thomas Shaw's grip tightened on Clara Tate's arm, his face a storm of grief and suspicion. Without another word, he marched her out of the house, calling for the servants to haul her down to the sheriff's office. "She killed my mom," he told them, voice breaking but firm. The local judge, Walter Kane, a young fellow with a soft spot for book-smart folks like Thomas, heard the commotion and took the case himself. Thomas stormed in, swearing Clara had driven Grace to her death. Walter called Clara up to the stand, eyeing her close. She looked shaken, sure, but there was a stubborn glint in her eyes, and she didn't shy away from his gaze. Walter couldn't square it. This slip of a woman forcing her mother-in-law to hang herself? Didn't add up. "All right, Clara," Walter said, leaning forward. "Your husband's claiming you pushed his mom to kill herself, and he's got the household backing him up. What they're saying true. If you've got a defense, lay it out. I'll dig into this fair and square, won't let an innocent soul get pinned wrong." Clara straightened up, meeting his eyes. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, "I've been wronged here. Today at lunch, I saw Grace, my mother-in-law, picking at her food, then heaving like she couldn't keep it down. I got worried, so after, I took her some apples and pie to her room. When I offered to fetch a doctor, she flew off the handle. First time we've ever fought. She's been good to me since I married Thomas, and I've always respected her. But today, she shoved me out the door. Come afternoon, she'd hanged herself. Walter rubbed his chin, mulling it over. Something about this felt off. Too many loose ends. After a beat, he leaned in again. You said she was sick at lunch, couldn't hold her food down, and lost it when you mentioned a doctor. Let me ask you this. How long's Grace been a widow? And this vomiting, how long's it been going on? Clara didn't miss a step. Your Honor, Grace lost her husband before Thomas was born, over 20 years now. As for the sickness, it started maybe a month back. At first, we didn't think much of it, just a spell, you know? But it kept getting worse, so I figured a doctor might help. Never thought she'd fight me on it so hard. It's my fault, I pushed her too far. Walter waved her off, cutting through the guilt. Hold up. Who'd Grace spend most of her time with lately? Any men around her regular? Clara caught the drift and nodded slow. I'll shoot straight, Your Honor. Grace stuck to her widow's ways fierce. Back home, Judge Kane's predecessor even gave her a plaque for it. Faithful wife, steadfast mother. When Thomas got his government post and we moved to the capital, she kept her distance from men to avoid talk. Even the servants were women, except for our butler, Henry Foster. He's steady, runs errands, brings back little gifts from town, sometimes for Grace too. But we all trusted him, top to bottom. Never had a reason not to. Walter nodded, then barked an order. Bring Henry Foster in here. He turned to his bailiff next. And get the coroner to check Grace Decker's body. 5 points, full workup. The coroner came back quick, stepping up to the bench. Judge, he said, voice low, she was 3 months pregnant. A gasp ripped through the courtroom. Thomas's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe it. His mom, the woman he'd put on a pedestal, carrying a child? Walter smirked a little, turning to Henry. Well, Henry Foster, you've been quiet as a mouse. Got anything to say now? Henry kept his head down, muttering, Your Honor, I don't even know what you're getting at. Walter wasn't buying it. He'd seen too many dodge the truth. We'll see about that, he said, sharp. Take him in, lean on him till he talks. They hauled Henry off, and it didn't take long. A few hours of hard questioning, some shouting, some pressure, and he cracked wide open, spilling everything. Half a year back, Thomas had been sent south by the governor to handle that flood relief. Funny thing, right after he left, Grace took ill. Henry, being the butler, called a doctor in for her. The doc poked around and said, it's just a nervous spell, missing her boy most likely. Brew her some tea, give her these pills, she'll perk up. That afternoon, Henry'd been out shopping and spotted some sour apples for sale. He remembered Grace once saying she loved him, so he picked up a batch to cheer her up. When he got to her room, no maids were around. Odd, but he didn't dwell on it. He knocked, and the door was already ajar. Grace called him in. Henry stepped inside with the apples, but then he froze. Grace's dress was half undone, slipping off her shoulders. He stammered an apology, turning to bolt, but she grabbed him from behind. Don't go, she whispered, voice trembling. He turned back, and there she was, 35 sure, but still a looker, with a glow that hadn't faded. Henry's blood ran hot, and before he knew it, they'd crossed a line, tangled up like husband and wife. Henry Foster couldn't hold out under Judge Walter Kane's pressure. Once he started talking, it all poured out like a busted dam. After that first slip with Grace Decker, crossing lines they shouldn't have, he couldn't stay away. Every few days, he'd show up at her room with some excuse, a trinket from town, a fresh batch of sour apples, and they'd fall into it again, like a habit neither could shake. A month later, Thomas Shaw came back from the flood relief down south, and Henry dialed it back, trying to keep his head down. But then Grace cornered him one day, pale and trembling. I'm pregnant, she whispered, and Henry's world tilted. A widow with a kid on the way? If word got out, Thomas would skin him alive, government man or not. Family honor ran deep. Henry scrambled, figuring he'd buy some back-alley medicine to fix it, make Grace take it and end the problem quiet. But the stuff he found was weak, half-baked. The baby kept growing, and Grace's belly started showing signs no dress could hide. They were stuck, no clue how to dodge the fallout. Then Clara Tate, sharp as she was, caught a whiff of something off. Grace panicked. Her whole life, her good name, would crumble if this got out. She couldn't face the shame, couldn't look Thomas in the eye. So she took the rope, climbed up on a chair, and ended it herself, leaving Henry in the dark till it was too late. When Henry heard she'd hanged herself, he froze, scared stiff at first. But then he thought, she's gone. No one knows it's mine. I can keep my spot here, play the loyal butler. He'd figured every angle, or so he thought. Never counted on Walter Kane sniffing out the truth from Clara's story. Back in the courtroom, Henry finished spilling his guts, head hung low. Walter didn't flinch. "Henry Foster," he said, voice like iron, "you're outta here, banished from this county. Step foot back, and it's the gallows." Then he turned to Clara. "Mrs. Shaw, you're free to go, cleared right here, right now." Thomas sat there, stunned, as the gavel banged. He'd pegged Clara wrong, blamed her when it was his own mom's secret tearing them apart. Guilt chewed at him, but Clara, big-hearted as ever, didn't hold it against him. She forgave him on the spot, and from then on, Thomas treated her like gold. They grew old together, never fighting again, a bond forged tight by the storm they'd weathered. And that's the tale, folks. Done and dusted. If you liked this one, drop a note below, give it a thumbs up, and share it around. Thanks for sticking with me. See you next time. Now, let's chew on this a bit. Grace Decker's story's a rough one. A widow who held the line for years, raised a boy to greatness, only to trip at the end. She couldn't resist a taste of something she'd locked away, and it cost her everything. Out here in the real world, I see it too. Folks in small towns, sticking to the old ways till temptation sneaks in. Sometimes it's greed, sometimes it's loneliness, but it's always a gamble. Grace rolled the dice and lost, left her son picking up the pieces. Point is, life's a tightrope. You can walk it straight, but one slip, and the fall's a doozy. Hope this sticks with you, makes you think twice about what's worth chasing.